Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Beyond Talking Points with Matt and Matt. I think it's been roughly a month since we've recorded one of these. Both of our schedules have just been crazy, but finally we found time to touch base again. And Matt had suggested to me another Soho Forum debate. This time between Bill Kristol and Scott Horton. And the topic being on U.S. interventionism. And this sort of harkens back to the episode we did when we were talking about neoconservatism, and joking how I will one day become a neoconservative. But we're sort of hoping to, as the podcast goes on, to talk more and more about foreign policy, because it's something neither of us know a lot about, and we want to learn a lot more before we go more deeply into it. But we still have opinions on it, because we have opinions on everything. But and I think our opinions actually generally converge when it comes to U.S. foreign policy and U.S. interventionism. But as Matt was saying to me before we started recording, our emphases in certain places, in certain key places, are still different. So hopefully it won't just be me saying something. It's never, me saying something and Matt saying, it's totally right, Matthew, I agree, and then dead silence. It's always yes, but, or yes, and. So I guess I'll just begin by making clear that I am not for U.S. interventionism. I am not in the Bill Kristol camp. I believe every time the U.S., or almost every time the U.S. has tried to intervene in another country's politics or intervened in foreign wars or foreign conflicts, it has, it's not necessarily done it for like altruistic reasons, right? So Bill Kristol is basically his whole argument in the debate to me was just like, well, yeah, but what about the alternative? He was basically like, if we hadn't done X, Y, or Z, the world would be 10 times worse. So we had to do X, Y, or Z. So in a weird way, Bill Kristol really wasn't even like defending interventionism. I mean, he was, but he was defending it from the most pragmatic possible standpoint, which is, we can criticize this all we want, but this has to be the way it is. No questions asked. But as with most, people who are pro-interventionist, it had a moral tinge to it. The idea that the U.S. is going out of their way to make the world a better place for democracy and human rights and whatnot. And so, I don't think the U.S. is often concerned with those things. I think that's sort of that rhetoric is used to persuade people, but it's not necessarily where our intentions lie. But the other point is often we just miscalculate, or we make some stupid error, or we make the situation 10 times worse than it was originally. So in other words, I think in non-interventionism, even if I accepted the moral side of the argument, it really fails on the empirical side of the argument, because a lot of foreign policy decisions. Let me rephrase that. When it comes to interventionism, there's just so many factors involved, and you can easily bungle things up, and you can easily make very stupid decisions. And you can't control the whole world. Like this is the problem with like the idea of one world government. It's just impossible. You can't control the whole world. And this is like, and in the same way, one country can't go around intervening everywhere and make everything, better, because there's just too much information to take in, and you're going to be reasoning from a very like limited framework. But that can lead you to can lead to negative outcomes, which you didn't foresee because of your limited framework. So I think that's where I'll leave off for the time being.
So, obviously, in the context of this conversation, I'm more with you, and I'm much more with you and Scott Horton than I'm with Bill Kristol. There's a lot that you touched on there that I would reemphasize, but I wanted to shed some light on a couple other points. So, if somebody watches this debate, I don't know if the listener is coming in having heard that debate or is coming in seeking commentary after or thoughts, but in the debate, Scott Horton really decimates Bill Kristol. Scott Horton was in front of a favorable audience, but it's like the way that they do those types of debates, Scott still won more people to his side than Bill Kristol won to his side. And it's really clear why, I thought. And it just seems more of the case was Bill Kristol was deeply, deeply unprepared. And I don't really blame Bill Kristol for being unprepared. So Bill Kristol spoke in platitudes relative to how Scott Horton talked. Scott Horton cites specific times the U.S. intervened. Scott Horton said specific times the U.S. intervenes in foreign affairs, and then it ends up causing worse issues. And he can specifically cite several things. So then when Bill Kristol tries to act like history started on September 11th, everything he says is like shot down. It's like, no, it didn't. And then he talks about stuff that kind of set that up. So he is bringing the ammunition of facts on the ground. But typically, when you encounter these types of discussions in U.S. politics, it is usually platitudes versus platitudes. And I think the reason why Bill, because his platitudes hold up to a large set of people when they're against platitudes from the other side. So a lot of the discussion on people who think like Scott Horton is, and this is a conversation I think you and I have had about interventionism, is something along the lines of interventionism is just inherently wrong. Like, why should the U.S. be meddling in these other countries? Like, I can't understand why we do that. It doesn't seem like it actually helps the U.S. It seems like an excuse for certain kinds of expansionism, and there are things you should be doing at home instead. Or it's like, why would we want to risk our troops being stationed and dying in countries we're not even at war with? Why should we be there? And these are moral questions, and usually interventionism is battled on these moral grounds. So then Bill Kristol is in perfect opportunity to act all high and mighty and say, actually, guys, you have to be pragmatic. You have to take the world seriously, and the world is dangerous. So then he gets to say his platitudes about how, since he's a very serious, respected person, you need to actually have troops there. And he can sound smart enough like he actually understands it. But then when you hold up his platitudes to history, which is what Scott Horton does, which is why he decimates Bill Kristol, he shows, like you were saying, this is a complex world, and it's really just us propping up bad people to take out the bad people that are in power. Because we're like, well, we need to get those bad people out of power. How do we do that? And prop up the other people who are against them. Well, they're bad too, or they go bad when they get power. So it's like, okay, well, we funded the guy who takes over a third world country and becomes the next evil dictator. So that's not good. And then we topple him 5 years later. So there is this actual rigorous problem with the neocon worldview, but they escape having to defend it on those grounds because they can sound rigorous relative to moral grandstanding from people on the left. And that makes it sound like a 50-50 moral intuition question. And this debate is so amazing because it really reveals it's not a moral, it doesn't need to be a moral question. On the pragmatic ground that Bill Kristol stands, he has shaky footing. Like, he has no right to say that the U.S. should be in all these places when it's like they funded, like the U.S. government helped fund Saddam Hussein, at one point and stuff like that. Like they set up these bad situations. So everything Bill Kristol says is based on like earned reputation from think tanks in D.C., not from any practical, proven like here's where this strategy worked well when you look at it in the grand scheme of things on a 30-year time horizon. That's what's so, I think, impactful of the debate. And that's kind of what you were getting at. You were getting at too there. So I think it made it really aware to me, though, how a person of Bill Kristol's caliber could seem so like pathetically underprepared for the situation, because it was like such an unique circumstance in terms of political discussions in the U.S. I don't know if that really resonated with you in that way, but that's what I at least observed there.
Yeah, so actually, listening to Bill Kristol's arguments, I think I gained a greater appreciation for his point of view. But at the same time, while gaining the greater appreciation, I understood more deeply why I despise his position. Because again, if you take if you look at it, I think if you don't think about it too long, I think it's easy for people, and this kind of gets back to your point, I guess, about platitudes versus platitudes. It's easy to like caricature, say, Scott Horton as this crazy idealist versus like Bill Kristol as this really sensible man. The neocon is someone who's actually truly in touch with reality because they're willing to deal with hard questions. They're willing to make tough decisions, regarding military intervention, regarding bombing certain places, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas, and this is not a good representation of Scott Horton at all, but you could like paint him as like a crazy hippie who doesn't believe a pacifist, someone who's whose belief system is just so abstract and like fanciful that it doesn't it shouldn't be taken seriously. But in fact, I think it's the exact opposite. It's the idea that it's the pragmatism in Bill Kristol, which is so fanciful. It's an illusion he's perpetuating, which but it doesn't seem like an illusion, sort of given the way he's presenting his arguments.
So I think one of the things that ties in, and or I want to emphasize, is I think a lack of rigorous discourse in politics and about the world is what leads us to these situations that end up being easily polarized and turned into 50-50 type situations where half the country or half of what one political party can fall on one side. I mean, it's like this brain heuristic, I guess a lot of people have, where if you're not told the probability of two events, your brain kind of fills in that each is equally likely, even when you like need a reason to think that. But somebody could sit down and they could think about a lot of historical situations in a very serious, rigorous way. And they could think, okay, the Soviet Union fell. I'm going to read 15 books about why the Soviet Union fell from like a wide variety of perspectives. I'm going to see how they got to that conclusion. I'm going to figure out the methodology of them getting to that conclusion. I'm going to see which evidence they point to. And instead of just evaluating who fits my conclusions best, I want to know who uses evidence in the most appropriate way and then see what conclusion they end up getting to understand this. But instead, when you talk to people of certain political persuasions, and it's like, I'm sure I fall into this trap because really everybody falls into this trap, at least to some extent. But if you talk to Bill Kristol about it, he is attributing every U.S. foreign policy success, whether that's actually something good or whether it's just the fact that we're all still alive today and survived the Cold War, he attributes it all to what the U.S. has done. And that's just like such a mind-boggling assumption when you really think about it, because we know all these things are so blurry. Like the Soviet Union could have fallen regardless of what the U.S. did if their economy was bad enough. So somebody could trace the fall of the Soviet Union and say, actually, this is like the inherent failure of the way that this substructure is set up that led to like mass starvation, blah, blah, blah. But then you can have people without even thinking it, not along to somebody like Bill Kristol saying, this is why we need U.S. international hegemony and U.S.-led international institutions. And it's the like sentences sound smart. You throw jargon in there, right? You're citing historical events that random people don't know off the top of their head. But there's no reason to think like that. That's the best case for the point he's arguing. That's the best selection of evidence. And it's just like, oh, I'm going to take a few things that, they sound smart because they are smart. They are points that are real, that are based on things that the layman doesn't necessarily know. But there's no reason to associate cause and effect and like such a link that like Bill Kristol does. And it just shows that like that's how every issue turns into like, well, but are you anti or pro war? And is it because like, okay, because like we shouldn't be at war, or because like, you know, we need war sometimes. It's like those things just like those 300, you know, feet conversations overhead are almost like painful when I look at them that way. It's like you're talking about an abstraction that implies things that shouldn't even necessarily be implied. You almost have to look at it in such a more narrow way and then pull out like natural principles of like human behavior from it or something like that. But they're starting from like post hoc rationalizations of, but I mean, anarchy would have been bad, right? Not having a, you know, 3% of GDP on military, or probably much more than that on military. You know, we couldn't have that. So yeah, he doesn't, and this is another thing, I apologize for belaboring these points, but he never even makes the case of like to what extent the US should be intervening. He just is like, yeah, intervention is kind of needed. He doesn't say like we should have 2 submarines with nukes. He doesn't defend our current fleet. He doesn't do any of that. He just kind of like is like, yeah, and then you got kind of go along with what the experts say. Well, whatever. It's like that is blind faith. That is like the essence of ideology. That really bothered me. I was actually hoping. I always get hope that the neocons will bring something rigorous, I guess, that is substantive, and I didn't find that here at all.
I mean, I think I might have said this before, but you know, neoconservatism, and of course, you know, Bill Kristol, son of the famous Irving Kristol, who coined the very term. And Irving Kristol, of course, his life is, you know, very interesting because like he went from, this is like, he's one of the people who might have like, you might have gotten the like Trotskyism to neocon pipeline idea, because he used to be a Trotskyist, and you know, then he went to being more of a liberal or social democrat, and then he became more of a conservative, you know, et cetera, et cetera. But I think the neoconservatism is it comes out of like American exceptionalism. It comes out of that America as religion. Not to say military intervention comes from America. Obviously, countries were intervening militarily way before the U.S. was even conceived. But because the founding fathers and you know said in their pamphlets and their books, like, this is a new beginning, we're going to start all over again. You know, we're going to truly create a government for, of, and by the people, and we're going to incorporate these Enlightenment values, and we're going to just leave all the horrible stuff of Europe behind. And so like you can trace you can look at like you know, Thomas Jefferson's writings, and like Thomas Jefferson, like, I guess by our political standards, which are hard to like really kind of map across time, but by our political standards, he was like more of a left. Well, maybe that's even disagreed, but I think he was a bit more of a left winger by his standards. But at the same time, he was like, and this is why labels break down, he was for that like American he was for spreading democracy around the world. Like he truly believed, like, yeah, this is we have created a, you know, not a perfect system of government, but a better system of government than it had ever been conceived before, and it's going to be exported. We're really going to a democratic age is going to be upon us. So even if Thomas Jefferson wasn't the neocon, you know, in the way that Bill Kristol is, just because the world was so different, that sort of attitude of like America's, you know, the world is basically going to become America. The American values are going to become universal values. That you can trace that from the beginning of the country until now. But every like major power, you know, really kind of had a similar illusion of like, oh, our values are, you know, going to be universal values. We're going to, you know, civilize all these barbarians, and we're going to make the world into a better place. And we're never going to, you know, history is never going to or our history is never going to come to an end. Our successes are never going to come to an end. We're going to buck the rules of history and somehow, remain triumphant. But any country who ever thinks that will, not necessarily like collapse into oblivion and totally and stop existing. Like the UK, their empire disappeared, half a century ago, more than half a century ago. They're still there. They still exist. The English language and English culture are still important, but their empire's gone. France's empire is gone. The list goes on and on.
So what you're laying out, I almost want to say is and I think you might think this is funny coming from me, because we've often had weird word arguments over the nature of man, and the implications of saying that there is a nature of man. But in our like lizard brains, we do have in-group and out-group biases, and that political idea is just an offshoot or an expansion of, and this is me kind of workshopping the idea. So I'm not necessarily saying this with the utmost certainty, but I'm just kind of shooting this out there. This is what I was thinking as I was hearing you talk. That can be an outgrowth of how like a lot of people want other people to like the things they like. And this is like almost it's like a childish feeling you might have, but like when you enjoy something, you'd like to think other people also enjoy that thing. And it can be something stupid. So it's like, why does it matter that I like the movie that you like? And it's like, well, there is some sort of in-group like overlap, and it doesn't really matter. I don't gain anything from you sitting down for 2 hours and fist pumping during a movie that I fist pumped during because something cool happened. Like, I don't actually gain anything from that. But there is this will that like we want other people to be more like us than more not like us. And when you put a country that is relatively powerful, like you put people in power who that are ambitious in that way, relatively powerful to other countries, of course they're going to think, I want to export our winning ideology. I want other places to be like us, because every country that's big wants, I think for that basic reason, to be the one world nation. Which I think that's an interesting idea that I'm not necessarily opposed to, like agreeing with that. And then I have to think, okay, well, what things are inevitable because of it, or what things do we have to strive to fight against our impulses? Because I'm saying that, and that is the case for, and that's why there will always be a brand of neoconservatism coming from the largest, most powerful governments, really at all times. Because like China, I mean, you probably think China has to want to outsource their values, right? That's why they make all these international power plays. Even if I think it's overblown and I think they're going to implode, they still have that ambition, even if they fail, as did the failing nations historically. So I think that's something to kick around, like the human drive to force others to be like them. It's not even about necessarily power. It might just be about fitting in. And people always want more. It's never okay to be like, okay, we have half the world. Like it's never good enough. But as we know, the problem with Bill Kristol's whole philosophy is neoconservatism doesn't work, right? So it's like we all have this drive that if you maybe expand it into a worldview or expand it into government centers of powers, you end up at something similar to neoconservatism. Yet neoconservatism fails. That's interesting. So is that why every nation has to fail eventually? Maybe that's a theory. But I was observing what you were saying as something that might actually be very tragic in terms of the human condition. And I just think that's some food for thought, or something to sit with, maybe.
I mean, I guess I would prefer to use the term neoconservative a bit more strictly than that. But you can't extrapolate it to what you're talking about. I mean, and I think it's not like it's not a mystery to me, I guess, why people want others to be like them, or want others to like what they like. Because psychologists say that a child kind of like builds his or her identity by talking. And by that, and when they say that, what they mean is children like have all these ideas, or feelings or thoughts in their head, and their personality, at least the parts of it that aren't like entirely like just biologically ingrained within them. The parts that are like more liable to I guess environmental factors. They get feedback from their parents about I guess what they should or shouldn't say, or about their opinions, or their how they should think about X, Y, or Z. And of course, something that we talk about often, or at least I bring up often, is the social nature of man. And so that's another reason I think why you would want someone to be like you. It can be like a bonding experience. You feel less isolated, if all you have is your own experience, but other people around you, other beings around you have a similar experience, then that can, there's more social cohesion. There's a greater sense of self, insofar as yourself is reflected by other people, like I mentioned. But as to like the historical or political implications of that, I think I've become pretty pessimistic about like looking at human history from a bird's eye view. I don't think we'll ever like get rid of that impulse to want other people to be like us, and therefore want to dominate other people. I don't think. I think we could probably strive in different directions, because human nature is so like we have contradictory drives, but I think there are certain drives which probably aren't escapable, and I think the will to impose your ideas onto other beings or other groups or other people, I see that as just sort of a fact of history, which it doesn't like. I'm not happy about it. I don't like that, but I don't see a way around that. I don't see how we can like escape that, or how we can stop doing that. There really aren't like new beginnings in history. It's sort of and this is why like, well, I was going to say this is why I actually think I'm more of the constrained view than Thomas Sowell might think I am if I were sitting down and have a conversation with him, because of my overall pessimism regarding human history. What is either Edward Gibbon or Voltaire, but both of them, preeminent 18th century historians. Like history is, a collection of the crimes of humanity, or something like that.
Well, it's funny that you say that, and I guess I don't. I'm only saying it because I had this thought when you were opening up, and I jotted it down then. So you bringing up Thomas Sowell, I think I have to dance in that territory for just a minute. But the way that you were talking about how Bill Kristol, he defends the way he defends interventionism, it was kind of like because he had to, because he kind of said what was the alternative. And a lot of times when I've argued with people on this podcast, like you or other people we've had on, we've had arguments about the government and the state. And a lot of times I think you've kind of come to the idea of like, well, I don't like the United States government. I'm not defending the United States government, but I'm going to defend the idea of government because I think and I know you don't necessarily feel this way all the time, but or like maybe I don't need to just single out you. Maybe like Keegan has said, but we still need one for at least these small things. So it's kind of like we have to do it anyways. And like the reason that you're laying out against Bill Kristol is history doesn't back up neoconservatism. And Thomas Sowell would agree. Well, it's weird. It's almost like Thomas Sowell has like the flip blind spot that you have, because Thomas Sowell, from what I know, didn't talk much about interventionism and likely fell in line in certain neoconservative types of views. But he would disagree with you on economics, right? Because he would say that your economics are kind of you saying, well, we can do these things better. And then he'd be like, no, you should look at all these historical examples. Like, we are limited in ways of incentives and second and third order consequences. And he would apply that to certain more leftist views on how to reduce income inequality and how that would just cause other issues. And I think that's I think that's just kind of the I guess it was funny to me. I don't know if you find that funny. I don't mean that in an insulting way, but a lot of what you're saying negative, and Bill Kristol pretty much saying, hey, the government didn't centrally plan neoconservatism well, is like the same reason why I guess I kind of give a hard time to a lot of the economics you've historically supported. So I kind of wanted to shed a light on that, not to be a jerk. I don't know if you have thoughts on that. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but the way you brought up the constrained vision, so I had to go there. so I apologize if that's not the direction you want to walk down.
I mean, my response has to be there are just certain areas of study which are beyond my beyond the knowledge that I have in this point in my life. But at the same time, perhaps Thomas Sowell and I then would disagree, or like perhaps the conversation we're having is on what what is in our control and what is beyond our control. So maybe Thomas Sowell and I would disagree on the second order consequences of A and the second order consequences of B, or like what a government can do in this situation versus what a government can do in that situation. So I just I was speaking out against this idea that like someone on the left has to be a pie in the sky, ahistorical, child who believes that you can make that man is just entirely malleable and you can do anything with man given any circumstances, because that's just man is entirely a blank slate. Like that's the sort of the caricature of the left, or that's sort of I guess what Thomas Sowell thinks he's fighting against. And I'm trying to say, no, someone can, support, this leftist policy without necessarily believing in totally unconstrained human nature or perfect knowledge or perfect information. I'm sorry, That's a vague answer, but that's the answer I have to give you at the moment.
No, that's fine. That's on the right track too. It's more of just like I can imagine Bill Kristol and AOC being in two different topics, but they would both say something along the lines of, if there's the will, then they're okay. How do I put this? AOC a lot of times will say, if people care enough about this thing, we can get it done. And I know that people want it, even though there's only like 10 people in Congress who are in favor of it. So she'll just be like, we can do it. Anybody who's saying otherwise just believes blah, blah, blah. But if there is a will, there is a way, right? So I can imagine Bill Kristol and AOC both saying that, but Bill Kristol is saying it about central planning, foreign affairs, and AOC is saying it about economic injustice or something like that. But the reason why I think this is relevant is because the reason why both of them are wrong is because they're saying the reason you can't do it, well, they're half right, which is actually the really interesting part. Because if there is a will, then you do get it. Because the whole point is that the whole saying derives from that there's no such thing as free lunch. So if you're willing to give up enough, you can get to really any conclusion, right? So AOC will say things like, if we want to make sure climate change never happens, we just have to do it. We can do it. It's just about if people want it enough. So she is admitting there is some sort of trade-off or action. The issue is a lot of times the people who are partial to getting that thing done like to underestimate what that cost is, either for political political palatability or just to because they actually believe it incorrectly. So people like the people at the dispatch, like I know I talked to you about David French a bit, but they'll make the case for keeping those thousands of US bases all in other countries by saying, well, it's not that expensive and it's doing a lot of good because we haven't had a foreign attack from that country in however many decades. But in reality, it's like, I don't think they really grasp the extent of the costs because they don't believe in things like blowback, right? So when it comes to foreign policy, they don't really think in the terms of, hey, when we bomb certain strategic places, we actually might be causing the terrorists down the road, like we did in 9/11, or for people who were recruiting people for 9/11, to take part in certain terrorist attacks. So by not actually weighing the costs, they can be misleading about them to make their case for saying we do have the will to make these trade-offs, but they're being dishonest. And then I would just say that the same type of argument applies to people when they talk about economics. So it's like, yeah, we could get rid of a lot of income inequality, but we'd have to do certain things. And those things might sound easier until you talk about the other things that flow with that one thing. So everything sounds easy when you just talk about the one thing the government would do, but not the 8 unintended consequences from it. And I think that's why they fail. I don't even necessarily think it's like saying it's a knowledge problem almost makes it sound more philosophical and abstract, which in a way demeans it. It's almost just like a lack of multi-step thinking in creative ways and then weighting the actual likelihood of it in a realistic way. So it's not really like I don't have the information. It's like I am not truly going to reckon with potential consequences, the likelihood of those, and how much everything has roots into several things. And I think it's just in both the situations. But I don't want to beat a dead horse more than I just stumbled and stuttered through that. So yeah, I'm leaving that there. You can have the last word on that point at least.
I mean, I guess I don't want like the a listener to take away. I mean, like I'm not an ANCAP, so obviously there's something where, and I mean, part of it might just be I don't know X, Y, or Z, and I don't know enough about X, Y, or Z, but I'm not an ANCAP. You're an ANCAP. Obvious point, I know, but like if we both agree in that about unintended consequences, or we both agree there's not a free lunch, or we both agree that central planning to at least to some degree is impossible. Central planning, particularly on a really, really large scale. I think when you're a smaller nation might be able to do more, like a government of a smaller nation might be able to control more, have more wiggle room than a large empire. Or if you're just doing a policy, if Switzerland enacts a policy, it's not to say there's not blowback, or it's not to say there might not be unintended consequences, but the scale is smaller than, say, the U.S. intervening in that country, in this or that country. So I guess like the way I'm thinking about it is like, where then, if we're both agreeing, or if we're agreeing mostly in this conversation on like, I guess the foundations, I guess where are we disagreeing, or like where where are our particular blind spots, or where could we come to maybe agree with the other person, and then I guess at the same time, I don't think so. When I say I'm like a pessimist about human history, it's not because I think I want to stay in my room all day and eat potato chips and watch Netflix and just watch the world burn. I'm not a fatalist. I'm not someone who wants people to give up. And this is why we were having that disagreement about whether or not you should change the world. I would still say you can aim to make the world a better place as you see it, but have realistic expectations about what you can do, and have like the ability of self-criticism, have the ability to like look at yourself and question your core beliefs, and question your most cherished opinions, and and I don't know if someone would say like, well, what about, the neocons want to change the world too? And so this is kind of like I guess someone's criticism of the idea of changing the world, because they say, oh, look at all these bad people that want to change the world. You don't want to be like those bad people that want to change the world. But I don't think just because some bad people also want to change the world doesn't mean you should give up and do nothing. It doesn't it doesn't even mean you should purely focus on, it doesn't even mean you have to lead a purely like self what's the word I'm looking for? It doesn't mean you can't give up on like larger social issues. It doesn't mean you have to like, just go to your office job and like, go to the grocery store with your wife and pick up your kids from school and just focus on that narrow, like on your like little neck of the woods. I mean, it's important to focus on your little neck of the woods, but you can also think about like bigger questions, and you can also think about like, social policy and other and foreign policy. So that was sort of long and rambly, but that's where I think I'm at in this conversation. I don't want people to do nothing, and or at least I'm not recommending it as an action. And I want to know where like our disconnect is between agreeing on the foundations, but not coming to the same overall worldviews.
I don't disagree with that. So I mean, we've argued about that, so I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, because the degree we argue is like very, very different than what you're just saying, because it's like it's an aside point, so I'm not going to belabor that. We've had that in the past, but I agree with everything you said there. Now, one thing that raises, which I kind of wanted to bring up in the context of this debate, is the degree in which there is an honest discussion. Or I guess I'm curious on where you stand in terms of like how critical political discussion on these issues is, because what I'm observing, and I talked about this earlier, but it seems like it's generally such a low level of interfacing between people on the left and the right, or people who are pro-war and anti-war. I know that doesn't fall as equally as other issues tend to, because he's on like I don't know. I think he's like an honorary member of AEI's board or whatever. He shows up at like National Review type stuff. He's I think he's at not the Dispatch, the Bulwark. I think he might be like the editor-in-chief or the founder or something like that. He's in that ballpark. And I don't care if I'm screwing up his credentials. It doesn't matter. No, in reality, nobody really cares about Bill Kristol. But he is a, big name, in quotes, like in the establishment paradigm. Bill Kristol isn't interacting with people who are really pushing him in tough ways, in a way that is happening in front of a large amount of people. I was actually disappointed, because the Scott Horton debate has a lot of traction in the libertarian circles. And like, sure, that makes sense. Soho Forum debates lean libertarian. Reason sponsors them. The guy who owns it, Gene Epstein, awesome dude. He's also like libertarian, or in that camp, So I listen to neocon stuff that I disagree with. I listen to it regularly. Like, they didn't go back to this debate and say, hey, Bill Kristol killed this guy. They didn't go back to this debate and say, hey, Bill Kristol lost, but if he was prepared, he should have responded this point with this point with this. I don't see any will to have a lot of attention on a rigorous debate on these issues. That is something that like has to be reckoned with when we talk about change in the world. Or it needs to be reckoned with that like those types of discussions won't happen, and that's okay anyways. We can operate in the stereotype, low-level moral arguments, because that's all we can get across in sound bites. So I was curious what your thoughts are on there, because I just don't think a conversation at Scott Horton and Scott Horton and Bill Kristol's level can happen on like a grand stage. Like, you'll never see something like that on a presidential debate stage. I just don't think you can. I don't think it will happen. So I kind of wanted to hear out maybe your thoughts on that.
So I think and we won't certainly get into the details of this, but with when Joe Biden pulled the troops out of Afghanistan, that like was, I mean, it wasn't a shocker to me necessarily that like most mainstream outlets, including the liberal ones, were like very critical of him. But the like consistency at which they were critical of him and the the utter stupidity that they were spewing, like the level of discussion was like below like your average NPR level of discussion. But that was like, it was like well-known like political commentators on the left and the right were talking below like their minimum. They were like doing everything they could to paint a picture of like, oh, look at Joe Biden, he's like these poor Afghan women, he's making us look weak, he's a terrible president now, he's stupid, he's short-sighted, the Middle East is going to go to hell in a handbasket now because we're not there to supervise everything. It's just the most I mean, basically what we've been talking about this whole time. It was surface level, but it was like surface level in the extreme. And but the fact that people thought that well, either the people like presenting these arguments, either they truly don't think they're surface level, or they're just that nefarious and like that they're just playing chess at such a higher level that that they're able to put forward these they're able to pull the strings behind the scenes in ways that we'll just never understand. I guess I tend to think they actually believe this these platitudes and these empty phrases are the highest level of discourse. So it was it was revolting to me. Now I guess I'm using moralistic language here, but I was shocked at I was shocked at how like blatant the propaganda was. So to some degree, I almost expect propaganda to at least appear to make sense. Now, of course, I guess I'm biased in the non-interventionist direction. So maybe it was a little easier. Maybe I don't know if someone would say to me, "Well, Matthew, because you're biased in that direction, that's why it was so." Like, it's not necessarily as obvious to other people that it was blatant propaganda, but at least from where I was standing, it seemed the propaganda seemed sloppier than usual. So I actually think I do agree with you. I don't think we're allowed. I don't think a discussion like the one that that took place in the Soho Forum debate would be allowed on a presidential stage. I don't think you're not gonna like hear it on like a soundbite. You're not gonna hear it in a soundbite on a CNN interview. The level of I guess manipulation of information and manipulation of language is so deeply entrenched in the media, in politics, that it's not that it's like, I guess, impossible to escape it, but it's, at least for the time being, it's just it's where we are. Which is why a lot of politics, which is why I think so many people like tune out of politics, because of how much drivel is presented as brilliance. I don't know. That doesn't really answer your question, I guess, as to how we change the world. I think you can attempt to move the discussion or move the goalpost, or you can attempt to change the level of discourse in minor ways. Someone like Noam Chomsky, he's not going to be on CNN explaining his views, right? Because he has to go and do a 15-minute lecture on what the U.S. did in Cuba 50 years ago. But it's like by that time, that's like a fourth of the program. So it's like you can't have that. It's like, okay, Noam Chomsky, you have to tell us your views in like 2 minutes. Go. Like, and then what's he gonna say? He has to probably say the most cliche things imaginable. But then it's like then he's lost 50% of his audience because like when you talk in sound bites, then it's easy for someone to dismiss you. But I guess whether you hate Chomsky or love Chomsky, I guess he's had an effect on the discourse. He's not had an effect on at least the mainstream media's discourse. He's not had an effect on he's not had like an obvious effect, I guess, at least in the short term. But he's had an effect on he's changed people's minds. He's gotten other people outside the establishment to think about things. And you could make an argument maybe that the U.S. foreign policy was a bit more. Well, I don't know. I'm not. Maybe I don't believe this. But I'll throw this line out there anyway, just for food for thought. Maybe our behavior in our foreign policy is less bad than it used to be because there were people who were willing to go outside the mainstream viewpoint, even if that mainstream viewpoint was ultimately left intact, at least among the institutions and the media. Yeah.
Okay.
And like the Vietnam War versus some modern wars, it's a little bit different because there's less. There's the draft, of course, and there wasn't as much information now. There wasn't the internet, of course, but the human carnage in the Vietnam War. And I guess the technology was a little less inferior as well, but the carnage in the Vietnam War just seems so barbaric in a way that other certain modern conflicts don't seem. But on the other hand, maybe that's just because our technology's become so advanced that we can kill people in more efficient ways, and it seems less barbaric. At this point, I'm thinking out loud, but
yeah. Well, I'm going to touch on the part you're thinking out loud about, and then I'll bring it back to the broader topic that I just want to hit on for a few more minutes before we wrap up. But I think what Scott Horton would say to that is that you have that impression because of the way wars are covered, and it doesn't in the time of Vietnam, we were thinking of our troops, American troops shooting down people. But if you look at things like in Syria and Libya and Yemen, things like that, there has been a lot of murder and death involved in certain insurgencies and keep civil wars afloat where hundreds of thousands of people have died. So it's not as obvious that's on U.S. blood's hands. And because it's not American soldiers shooting people, it doesn't get reported in the same way here. But that's what he was kind of pointing out to Bill Kristol at one point, that all that's on the U.S.'s hands. And that would be the case for we haven't learned from Vietnam. And the only other thing I'd stack on that too is Vietnam was a war where we didn't have a definitive win condition. And that's exactly what the war on terror was. It was, we don't have a win condition. We're just going in. And that's why we pulled out of Afghanistan, because you can't have wars with no win condition to shoot for. You just kind of do things there, and eventually it isn't a good objective. So then you have to eventually lose, right, and give it up at some point on some time horizon. But I wanted to make the point on media selective attention. And that's kind of what you're bringing up with Afghanistan. And it's scary because it worked, right? So half the country, if you look at it on on R&D lines, is if you split it 50-50, okay, you got Democrats, you got Republicans. I know there's independents that lean both ways, blah, blah. Let's just say it's 50-50. That means all the Republicans are primed to not like whatever Joe Biden does. So even though those Republicans were allegedly anti-war when they were cheering on Trump, and a lot of people got behind that message, every time Joe Biden does anything, those people who hate Joe Biden in their lizard brain that says, I want to attack my outgroup, is jumping on any error that Joe Biden makes. Now, the thing the media does is they present something that is true, which is that pulling out of Afghanistan did have some very bad optics, Some people did die. It caused a lot of havoc, right? Now, you can have an intellectual argument about how much that needed to happen, how should they have pulled out if they were going to pull out, which way would have caused the least damage. And that is like a real conversation you could have, which is why the media can get away with paying the selective attention on like Biden screwed up, right? Because there is like a real debate that you could have. But instead, they cover it in a specific way to kind of appeal to hawks, which, it gives all the Republicans this talking point. Wow, Joe Biden screwed up. Now we get free points. Even CNN agrees with us. Wow. And then a lot of more normal people see CNN not liking what he did. And they do, some level of people, even though the media has a very low approval rating, like in the 20%, still means 20% of people listen to the news and generally, think it should be respected, right? That's not negligible, especially when it's probably a lot of Democrats. So like Joe Biden, I don't know if you've been following this, but he's at like a very, very, very low approval rating right now. And a lot of that trend, that slope downwards, started because of the Afghanistan news coverage, because you already had the Republicans hate him. But now even some Democrats think he's incompetent, because a lot of people think of the war state and managing the war state as a signal of competence. And that's because the media chose to selectively cover it in a way that made Joe Biden look bad for not being hawkish. They could have covered it for, it was the right thing to do. It could have been done better, but here's all the reasons it's good we're out of there. They chose to focus on very specific things that were true, that highlight his incompetence as a leader, to make it look bad that he wasn't hawkish. Now, if a Republican runs against Joe Biden, they're going to point at Joe Biden's bad record on Afghanistan, and they're going to be hawkish. Like, it's like this dialectic. And it worked, apparently, because, that's the main reason why Joe Biden has seen a downslide in his approval rating. I mean, inflation being more pervasive than the elites told us is also a contributing factor, but Afghanistan is what really started that. And I don't mean to say this as if it's a counterpoint to anything you've said. I just more think of it as like, I like to have productive conversations. And this isn't a knock on you. It's a knock on a lot of people I talk to who agree on me with moral principles. We're all like, oh, it's so unfair. The media mischaracterizes this. They leave out this fact. But it's beyond that. They give selective attention on certain issues. And sometimes, even though they lose a lot of credibility and like Tim Pool can own them and Tim Pool can get a ton more views than you'd expect him to get relative to CNN, but sometimes it doesn't matter, because sometimes it still works. And if it still works in the realm of the war state, that's really bad, because the war state is a huge amount of spending. It's a huge amount of terror in the world. And that's something that has to be baked into any grandscaping ideas, I guess, of how to move forward. That's why I bring it up. So I appreciate, too, that you entertained that, too. Because me and Matt, sometimes we talk a little bit about where we think our conversations will go. But this one, I definitely put him on the spot a few times. So I'm really glad you entertained that and you contributed a few things that I found very interesting.
Well, this is sort of playing devil's advocate on a minor point. Well, I don't think it's that minor, but it's not necessarily like I guess you don't have to give the perfect answer to it. But I'm just sort of curious as to like whether like, the situation, I guess, has gotten better, or the behavior of the U.S. government overseas has gotten any better, or if it's totally stayed the same. Why do you think then, like, Joe Biden was the one that pulled the troops out finally, and not Trump, and not Obama? Is it just like, oh, Biden is just? Is it just like some idiosyncratic thing related to Biden? Is it just like something related to his character, related to his like political strategy? Is it like just totally random? Like it happened, to be Biden because X, or could you make the argument that a lot of these arguments from anti-war activists led to a situation where, as much as I despise Joe Biden, someone got in the White House who was willing to make a big move in that direction. Now he's still being hawkish in other areas of the world, and there's a million other reasons to hate on Joe Biden, but he did do this one thing, which I'll give him credit for till the day I die. Why do you think now is when it happened? And how does that relate to I guess your argument, or that it's not our behavior overseas isn't really any better than it was in Vietnam?
Yeah, well, part of me wants to take that the route of it depends how 8D chess everything is, right? So like one could say Joe Biden felt like he had to do it, and this is one of the main, I guess, narratives or the main answers to your question, because Trump said when he was president that by the 20th anniversary of 9/11, troops would be out of Afghanistan, and maybe canceling that would have been something that Joe Biden's people found not politically palatable because they don't want the perception of being hawkish, right? So that this was something that was in the works. So maybe they were concerned about optics. They didn't want to look hawkish because even though they are, right, even though Democrats are still, vote, they are constantly voting in favor of the war state. They don't want that perception. They want to be the doves. They want to have that public view of getting those votes. And then they couldn't back off of that one thing. That's why, as you said, they're still hawkish in Yemen, right? But at least they're not in Afghanistan. So that could have been the impulse there. Everything else, I think I could posit would sound conspiratorial unless I had more evidence at hand to make the case. So that's the theory that I think I'm most comfortable with, if that helps.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm not necessarily, I guess, disagreeing with you or wanting to go down 50 different rabbit holes, but I actually probably am more in line with the idea that that is a sign, a very minor sign of progress, a very uneven sign of progress. But I think I don't necessarily think it's related to like conspiracies or related to higher level chess. I mean, part of it might just be Joe Biden, who generally has been less hawkish in his political career than many mainstream Democrats. Still hawkish, but less so than less so than Obama even, right? And Obama is sort of portrayed as more of a dove. So I mean, I think part of it is just kind of Joe Biden being Joe Biden kind of doing what it is Joe Biden has done over the years. But the other part of it is, I think, for whatever reason, you could say it's purely cynical. I think the elites are becoming less inclined. Or they're being more. They're becoming more. They're becoming more willing to, I guess, make concessions to anti-war activists and to, they're behaving less hawkishly, I think, in certain key areas, and again, you could say that's just because they're afraid of they're just afraid, like they're afraid of losing votes or whatever. Like I'm not even saying it's like good people doing good things, but I guess I'm not necessarily willing to say the U.S. government is behaving as badly as it always has. And I'm not. Well, let me rephrase it. I don't want to put it in simplistic terms, because you're not. This is not what you're arguing. But so I guess when I talk about being I guess certain things being inescapable, or like certain wills or drives being inescapable, I don't think that means progress doesn't exist. And so I do think the U.S. government in certain ways behaves better than it did, even in the same arena, or even on the same issues. So I guess that kind of goes back to my earlier point about how about changing the world, or about changing discourse. You can make you can get things done. I guess is what I'm trying to say, and I think back when Chomsky was first becoming being an anti-war activist, before he was he's been doing it for many decades now, since the 70s, I guess. Back when he was doing that, and back when other figures were becoming anti-war activists, I think all of that activism, all those books written, all those TV appearances, all of that leading up to now, I don't think it was all for nothing. And I think it did lead indirectly to a president who was willing to be less hawkish. A couple presidents, I'll give Trump credit for, where was he? He was less hawkish. It led to us being in a place where we can have presidents be less hawkish in certain on certain issues. So I don't know if that sounds too optimistic to certain people or too idealistic, but I think that's where I lean on that question that I posed to you.
I think the real emphasis on why I'm skeptical of that is because I don't want to confuse somebody being less hawkish and having the appearance of being less hawkish. And in politics and really in everything, optics are, king, right? So like if a bunch of people are convinced that something has to be a certain way, they have to abide by certain rules, and everything is shown them that's how they should live, they're going to do that if that is the perception of everybody, right? In politics, they care about how they are perceived, and I'm sure some people are well-meaning in a lot of ways, and they would like to go beyond being perceived a certain way and actually do certain things that make progress. But when it comes to if a politician's interests don't line up with their base, they care about the optics of it. And there are a lot of ways where I could see the optics of certain actions making somebody seem dovish, but things like Syria, things like Libya, things like, like how a lot of people still have the perception that Obama wasn't that hawkish. It wasn't until several years after the fact that a lot of people on the left have gone, actually, Obama was kind of awful on war, right? So it takes a while for the truth to kick in, and then people start going, well, actually, this many people got killed when Obama was president, blah, blah, blah. So I would hope to think that U.S. intervention has gotten less bad, but I would actually I wouldn't want to pool conventional wisdom of that, right? Or the perception of that to actually get a real idea. Because the thing is, they want us to think that we've slowly been stepping down and that we're, not really at war in the types of wars that people aren't happy with. But we're still interfering in all sorts of ways. But nobody, if you asked random people, how do you feel about U.S. intervention in a country that we're already in, they would say, oh, we shouldn't be there. And it's well, we already are there. People would have no idea. So I don't want to confuse those things. So there might be a lot of truth to what you're saying. I just don't know I would want to see something really rigorous before I would agree with that. And that's not the level of discourse that we're at, which is fine. Right. That's not a knock on you. That's just the qualification or the bar I would set, I guess. And I just think it's a real concern I have in the world we live in. But feel free to give your thoughts, and then I'll send us home.
I mean, I think the facts on the ground on Afghanistan. I think what Biden did on Afghanistan was what he should have done. I think the troops should have been pulled out. I think it was the right decision. And I think despite the optics, despite the chaos and despite the deaths, despite the Taliban taking over, I know you can throw the mainstream media is throwing all this at us and saying this is why it's a complete failure. And actually part of that is people are blaming Biden for it, but part of it was the intelligence services lying to Biden. And I'd have to find the sources for you. I don't have them off the top of my head, but it wasn't just Biden, stupid Biden doing stupid Biden things. It was the government, the U.S. government was lying to him, or there were people within the U.S. government lying to him about the situation, making it seem better than it was. And then, look, the optics look terrible. But if we're going purely from the facts on the ground, which is we're out of Afghanistan mostly, then I think I can't say that's a bad thing just because we're not out of Afghanistan. And I can't say it's not a bad thing or it's not a good thing because he's hawkish in other areas or because, we haven't pulled our troops out of everywhere. Sometimes you have to take, sometimes you have to take your wins where you can get them, even if they seem like very small wins in the moment, even if you're very unsatisfied with a million other things going on. And that's not even me necessarily being reformist, but that's me saying the Rome wasn't built in a day, and I uh, 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 I mean, I guess it is reformist. I guess I can't really get around that. But I only say it's not. I guess I'm not necessarily advocating for a political strategy, but I'm saying take your wins where you can get them, and that doesn't invalidate the wins just because you don't have everything.
I'm struggling to debate if I'm going to keep my word by giving you the last word, or if I have to get a thought in. How much of a I'm going to let you decide. Should I send this home, or should I keep the back and forth going? I know we're starting to beat a dead horse, so I don't want to unless you want me to. I'm okay. I'm okay letting you have the last word.
It's up to you.
God, dude, why do you have to do that?
Okay. I'll you can keep it going for another 5 minutes. We'll see what this.
It's just, I don't necessarily think it is a net win though. So you have to look at it like, if he pulls out of Afghanistan, and then we're all happy, we're out of Afghanistan, but he did it so he'd appear more dovish. It might be buying political will so he can do something worse in the future. So it's like, without the political will he earned from the perception of being dovish, that set him up to be hawkish later and then not get flack for it, because it's like, well, he pulled us out of Afghanistan, or nobody will notice because nobody's critiquing that end of Biden because he did something dovish once. So I guess I'm hesitant to even call it a real win, because even though that one thing is, it's almost like it's like how in accounting, you hit one side of the books and another side of the books, right? So for every thing you buy, there's something on the cost side. And I'm hesitant to say that, like, we actually got to win, because I'm worried that there's another thing on the other side of the ledger where it's like, well, actually, he did that dovish thing because now I can get away with continuing or expanding this other operation, and nobody's going to pay attention and nobody will give him flack for it. And now his party has more goodwill, even though he's made other things that are less in the popular imagination worse. So it's like, take your wins, but like, might not even be a win. Do we really know? Depends how much strategy is around the idea of what he did. That's where, like, how much are they planning? How much are things done on one-offs? Is there a strategy here to manipulate perception in favor of their political gain, so they get more votes in the future? And I think that's a very real potential thing when it comes to a big machine, a big party in, the United States. So that's where I think my concern lies more than yours.
I mean, I guess I would just say that I guess I'm less worried about the machinations of the Democratic Party and the U.S. government, because I think, I guess I'm not necessarily convinced that they're playing at the higher level that you might think they're playing at, or some people might think they're playing at. In other words, I'm not sure the people are so. I mean, I guess I would phrase it like this. I think the the government, the people leading this country, they're probably stupider than they might seem. And not to say there aren't real conspiracies going on, and not to say that there there aren't Machiavellian games being played that we don't understand because we're not in the green room. Not in the green room. I don't think that's the word, but it's to say that I guess I'm less worried about the blowback, because I don't think people are thinking that far, and I don't think I don't think these moves that, like, Biden's doing, or the moves that the Democratic Party is doing, I don't think they're as planned out or as artificial as they might seem. And for that reason, I don't see them as really playing into a larger mission of making, I don't think this one, dovish move is going to play into making the Democratic Party 10 times more hawkish, because I don't think the U.S. government is capable, or the people in power are capable of such power moves. I think that's sort of, I guess that's where I say that. I guess that's where I kind of come in and say that seems too conspiratorial to me to really hold water. I mean, I guess the part of what you say that I think I would agree with is, if I'm putting on my politician hat, which I do occasionally on this show, you do have to. Strategy is important. Strategy is important. You can't get away from that. It's not all about high moral principles. It's not all about you giving a speech. It's not all about like Bernie Sanders giving a speech about income inequality and the crowd cheering him on as such a noble soul. One reason Bernie Sanders failed in his mission, I think, is because he lacked a certain strategy that I think probably would have been necessary for his success. So I think it is important to sort of try to think about things in the bigger, try to think about how your actions will affect you and others in the long term. I guess I'm just not convinced that us leaving Afghanistan will really hurt the anti-war cause in the long term. But that's just a prediction which would have to play itself out before anyone really knew the answer to it.
Got it. And I agree with that. I was posing that more in the lens of political strategy, thinking, in that sense as like 5D chess, because they're actually trying to, yeah, you got what I meant. And I think that's a good place to stop too. So on that note, as we kind of talked about the debate and then we kind of meandered into tangents that we'd like to explore, I hope everybody enjoyed our interesting back and forth. I think we covered some somewhat novel ground, or at least wandered into territory that's relevant and worth thinking about. You can find the backlog of Beyond Talking Points on our podcatcher and YouTube channels just by searching Beyond Talking Points. You can find more of Matt's content. The Philosopher's Guide to the Apocalypse. Can't believe I almost forgot that one. So that's where you can find his solo show. You can find that on YouTube or podcatchers anywhere. You can find more of my stuff at the Obey Podcast. You can find me on Twitter at Matthew T. Keck, and you can find Matt on Twitter at Matthew Hazel. You can see his name on the screen if you're watching this, but his last name is Matthew. His name is Matthew Hazelwood, so it's Matthew Hazel WO with an 8. So you can find him there. We're active on there sometimes. If you seek me out and you comment on something, I'm sure I'll interact with you. I see that. I go on there all the time just to see all the stuff that will piss me off. So I'm always on there if you want to get in touch. I feel like I'm missing. I feel like I'm leaving something out. I don't know what it is though. Am I missing something?
The only thing I can think of is we're also trying to expand, not expand, but we're also having conversations with other people. So you can find us occasionally on other podcasts. So not too long ago, a couple weeks ago, I was on our friend Keegan's podcast, the Nietzsche podcast, and actually Matt will be on Keegan's podcast probably in the near future. And I was also on Into the Absurd podcast with someone I just met not too long ago through Keegan named Greg. And at some point, he might be on he might be on the show, or I might invite him on the solo show. But anyway, so occasionally, he or Matt here or myself will be on another podcast, or we'll just have another conversation with another interesting, person. So we'll try to keep you guys updated on that, and you can just find us in random places occasionally.
Yeah, and I appreciate they brought that up, because if we are on somebody's show, we definitely should give that a shout out, just so if people stumble on this and then they want to hear more or see us interact with other people, because we've done dozens of episodes only with each other. We've had a few guests on here and there, but we've had dozens of back and forth. So if people want a little bit of variety, I'm sure hearing you and Keegan talk about random things here and there is something worth noting of substance. But that's all we got today. So we'll follow up with more content soon. But sign off for now is Matt. Thank you.